title of this video is "We Are Not Pigs." Mill is supremely aware of the objection that utilitarianism reduces human beings to the level of pigs or swine by implying that we are motivated by nothing apart from physical pleasure. This is known as the swine objection, and Mill articulates it on page 210, just below his revised GHP. So I'm down here. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine only worthy of swine. Now notice, this is the first place in the text where Mill is speaking not in his own voice, but in the voice of one of his opponents. Then he goes back into his own voice to answer the objection his opponent has raised. And the answer is to notice that pleasures do not just differ in quantity, as Bentham taught, but also in quality. And here I'm on page 211 in this passage. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend upon quantity alone. Pay attention here to two different things. First, some pleasures are more valuable than others. Second, some pleasures are more desirable than others. Now, those are certainly connected, but they're two different ideas. To say that certain pleasures are more valuable than others is to say that they have greater moral worth, so that they're going to count more than others in our moral deliberations. They'll carry more weight as we think through which of our options is the most ethical one in a given situation. But in addition, Mill wants to say that certain pleasures are more desirable. That would mean not only are these pleasures we should choose because they're more valuable, they're pleasures we do choose over less valuable ones because they are more pleasurable to us. They're more attractive to us. So Mill is beginning to develop a theory of higher and lower pleasures, but he hasn't told us how to tell higher and lower pleasures apart. What's the rule for distinguishing them? Let's go back to page 211 to the second passage I've marked there. This is a bit of a longer passage, but it's important. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even though knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure which their nature is capable of, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. Now, it sounds like we need some kind of complex formula, complex mathematical formula to figure out what Mill is talking about. So let's see if we can translate it into our own words, which is always a good way to know whether we understand someone's point or not. The first thing we have to see is that Mill is talking about comparing two pleasures with one another. Okay, so apparently there's not a list of higher pleasures and another list of lower pleasures. Instead, Mill is talking about a particular situation where we have two pleasures we're trying to choose between. What he's giving us here is not a list or classification of pleasures. He's going to give us a rule or procedure for comparing two pleasures to one another. The procedure begins with take two pleasures. Then we have to find a group of people to help us make the comparison. These helpers need to have experienced both of the pleasures we're trying to compare. Otherwise, their help is not going to be helpful. Why would this be important? Well, it's probably obvious, but we're often tempted to make mistakes about this. Here's one mistake I see frequently. I listen to a lot of classical music, and play some too, but I also listen to jazz and pop and klezmer and world music and anything else that happens to sound good to me or that my friends ask me to listen to. But I often talk to classical music lovers who really are snobs, who want to claim that classical music is superior to all other kinds of music. Maybe it is somehow, but there's a problem. They don't listen to any other kind of music, so they don't have a basis for comparison. They're not competent to judge. Okay, but let's say we have a panel of competent judges. What then? Let's go back to our passage. We know that one pleasure is higher than another if these competent judges choose even the smallest quantity of that pleasure over the largest possible quantity of the other, even if acquiring the higher pleasure takes a lot of effort and even some pain to acquire than the lower pleasure. Well, this is quite remarkable, and we have to be absolutely clear on the fact that Mill is making a drastic change to Bentham's theory. For Bentham, the only differences that can exist between two pleasures are quantitative differences, meaning either one of the pleasures is more intense than the other, or one of them lasts longer than the other, or both. Otherwise, we can't use the utilitarian calculus to figure out the moral values of actions based on their pleasure consequences. And that is exactly what Mill is saying. Some pleasures differ so dramatically from one another in quality that quantity becomes a non-issue. If that's still not clear to you, let me try my favorite example. I love chocolate. At this point in the video, a bunch of you are nodding your heads. But let's find out how much I love chocolate. If I had 3 bars of excellent 85% cocoa dark Swiss chocolate, would I trade those 3 bars for 5 bars, for 10 bars, for 100 bars? Of course. That's just a matter of quantity. But what if I asked you a different question? If I could give you X amount of chocolate in return for you never having friends again, how much chocolate would I need to give you? 10 pounds? 100 pounds? 1,000 pounds? A container ship full of chocolate? For almost all of us, it's a ridiculous question. Friendship is so valuable and so desirable that we would not trade the friends we have in our lives for any amount of chocolate, no matter how large. Okay, so now that we get what Mill is up to, what difference does it make? Well, for starters, it means that he's not reducing us to animals, because animals are capable, human beings are capable of a higher quality of pleasure than other animals are. Animals don't take pleasure in helping animals in another country who are struggling economically, for example. Animals don't try to send animals to Mars or save the environment or a lot of other things human beings take pleasure in. It also means that there's no utilitarian calculus anymore, because some pleasures are so much higher in quality than others that quantity is no longer relevant. And so we find Mill giving you the same test or procedure or rule that he gave you before. But he's going to add one important qualification to it here, to which must be added their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation. I think it's because we're not always good judges of how much pleasure we take from certain things we experience. For example, our friends often know quite a while before we do that we're in love with someone. Our capacities for self-consciousness and self-observation can be quite limited. So we need to add the language about self-consciousness and self-observation to take into account the fact that sometimes something is a higher pleasure for us without fully realizing it. So as you do the rest of today's reading, from the middle of 214 through 227, I've prepared a handout on the 5 major objections to utilitarianism and Mill's answer. You can retrieve that from Brightspace. And you can use that handout to keep your orientation as you read. We'll cover the remaining 4 objections and replies pretty quickly in the next video.